Her AC broke, so she ended up in my room for the night, and nothing between us would stay the same. It was one of those stifling summer nights where the air itself seemed heavy, sticky against the skin, and every small movement made you sweat. I was lying on my bed, half reading a book, half listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, feeling the persistent warmth of the city seep through my open window. The kind of night that makes you restless even when you're trying to be still. That's when I heard it, a soft, frustrated knock on my door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, or that it was the neighbor from down the hall. The knocking came again, slightly firmer this time, accompanied by a voice carrying just a hint of embarrassment. "Hi, sorry to bother you," she said. Her tone was hesitant, careful, like she was stepping into territory she wasn't sure she had a right to enter. "My AC broke, and it's unbearable. Would it be okay if I stayed in your room tonight?" I froze for a moment. The question caught me off guard, not because of what she was asking, but because of the quiet vulnerability threading her words. She was my neighbor, a woman in her early 40s, elegant and confident in a way that made her presence noticeable even from across the hall. Yet tonight, there was a trace of helplessness in her eyes that softened her usual composure. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, of course. No problem." My voice sounded slightly higher than usual, and I noticed my hands felt warmer than normal. As she stepped into the room, I took in the small details I hadn't really noticed before. The faint scent of her perfume, a subtle mix of floral and something familiar, drifted into the air. Her hair caught the dim light from the lamp, falling softly across her shoulders. She carried herself with the same grace I'd always admired, but tonight there was something tender about the way she moved, careful not to impose. The heat made her cheeks flush slightly, and I felt a pang of protectiveness I hadn't expected. I motioned to the corner of the room, the small space where she could set up a blanket. "You can, just over there," I said, gesturing. She nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. It was a simple smile, but it carried weight, thankfulness, relief, and perhaps a hint of curiosity about how this night would unfold. We both stood there for a moment, awkwardly aware of each other's presence. Silence stretched, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I wanted to look away, to give her space, but my gaze kept returning to her, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her hand lingered on the edge of the blanket. Even something as small as that felt charged. The room felt smaller suddenly, but not in an uncomfortable way. More like a space where two lives, normally parallel, had been nudged close together by circumstance. And in that quiet, sweltering room, I realized that this ordinary, accidental night might change everything, if only we let it. The night stretched on, thick with the heat that refused to leave even as the fan spun lazily above us. She had claimed a corner of my room, spreading a blanket around her shoulders as if it could shield her from more than just the sticky air. I tried to focus on my book, but every rustle, every shift in her posture drew my attention. The space between us was narrow, closer than usual. I felt it in the way our elbows occasionally brushed as I reached for my glass of water, in the way she adjusted her blanket just slightly toward me, almost unconsciously. There was an awkwardness in that closeness, a kind of tension that neither of us seemed ready to break with words. At first, conversation was minimal. We exchanged polite comments about the heat, the city, trivial observations that would normally feel mundane but tonight hung in the air like unspoken questions. Her voice, soft and controlled, carried the faint tremor of discomfort from the heat, but there was a warmth underneath it too, a quiet, human vulnerability I hadn't noticed in her before. I found myself offering her a glass of water. Our hands met briefly as she took it, her fingers brushing against mine, and the simple contact sent a shiver through me. She gave a small, almost shy smile, and I realized I was holding my breath for just a fraction too long. A glance at her face told me she had felt it too, the subtle, electric acknowledgement that we were suddenly more aware of each other than either of us had expected. Time slowed. The rustling of the blanket, the quiet hum of the fan, the distant hum of traffic outside, it all became background noise to the shared, unspoken awareness in the room. I noticed her fidgeting slightly, curling her toes under the blanket, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The way she moved, even in discomfort, carried the same grace I had always admired, but now there was a softness to it, a kind of gentle fragility that made me want to reach out without seeming intrusive. We found ourselves drifting toward small, accidental moments of contact. A foot nudged mine as she adjusted herself, her hand lingered near mine on the bed edge as she shifted. We laughed quietly at some minor clumsiness, the sound breaking the tension but also making it linger, the shared amusement acting like a bridge between the awkwardness and something warmer. By the time the night felt settled, we were both aware of the intimacy of mere presence. It wasn't romantic in the obvious sense, but it was undeniably charged. Each gesture, each glance, each small movement carried weight. My heartbeat was slower now, more deliberate, as I realized that this night, born from a simple inconvenience, was quietly reshaping how I saw her. And judging by the way she occasionally looked at me, I wasn't the only one noticing. In that hot, crowded, yet strangely intimate room, I felt the first real shift, the understanding that the ordinary could suddenly become extraordinary, simply by proximity and attention. And as I lay back, watching her adjust the blanket one more time, I understood that tonight wasn't just about sharing a space, it was about discovering a closeness that neither of us had expected, yet neither of us would soon forget. Hours had passed, the oppressive heat finally softened by the slow approach of early morning. The fan had done little to cool the room, but the tension between us had begun to change, shifting from awkwardness to a quiet sense of companionship. The corners of her eyes relaxed as she settled more comfortably under the blanket, and I noticed her posture lose some of its careful stiffness. Our conversation started hesitantly, at first brushing over trivialities, the weather, the hum of the city outside, the stubbornness of my old fan. But gradually, it deepened. She began talking about her life in a way I had never heard before, her small victories, the loneliness she sometimes felt despite her confidence, the subtle regrets she carried but rarely admitted aloud. Her voice was soft, introspective, and there was an honesty in it that demanded careful listening. I listened. I asked gentle questions, careful not to push, letting her guide the narrative. I felt a thrill in the shared silence that often followed her words, a quiet pause where it seemed the room itself was holding its breath with us. In that space, it didn't matter that she was older, or that life had placed us on different paths, the vulnerability she showed created a bridge between us that I had never expected. At some point, her hand brushed against mine while reaching for her water. We froze. The contact was fleeting, barely a second, but it carried an unexpected warmth, a spark that neither of us tried to define or label. She glanced at me, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, and I felt a mix of exhilaration and careful hesitation. It was the first real acknowledgement, without words, that our presence mattered to each other in a way beyond simple politeness or neighborly concern. We laughed quietly at shared memories and small, humorous frustrations, and I realized I had never felt so connected to someone in such a short span of time. Her laughter, light and melodic, had a grounding effect, and the way her eyes softened when she looked at me made me feel simultaneously protective and seen. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but I held back, knowing that even this tentative closeness was something delicate and precious. The room around us seemed to fade slightly, the dim lamplight, the hum of the fan, the distant sounds of the city, all became a backdrop to the intimacy forming in quiet gestures and unspoken understanding. Every small movement of hers became meaningful, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she pulled the blanket closer around herself, the subtle shifts as she settled into her corner. Each motion felt alive, charged with a gentle tension I was learning to recognize and respect. By the time our conversation paused, we were both quiet, not from discomfort, but from a shared awareness that something important had shifted. A sense of mutual trust had begun to take root, fragile but undeniable. In that moment, I realized that this night wasn't just about her escaping the heat, it was about discovering a connection neither of us had expected. And though neither of us spoke it aloud, I felt certain that we had both sensed the beginning of something quietly profound, a bond that went beyond age, circumstance, or the ordinary. Morning light began filtering through the thin curtains, soft and gentle, casting a warm glow across the room. The heat of the night had started to ease, leaving behind a lingering warmth that wasn't entirely from the weather, it was in the quiet closeness that had settled between us. She was still curled up under the blanket, adjusting it around her shoulders, and I couldn't help but notice how the sunlight caught her hair, highlighting strands I'd never truly seen before. Without thinking, I reached over with the blanket I had just folded and draped it lightly across her shoulders. Our eyes met for a brief second, and she offered a small, almost shy smile. That simple gesture, the warmth of shared space, the careful attention to each other's comfort, spoke volumes. There were no words, no declarations, just a recognition that we were both paying attention, that we both cared in ways neither of us had anticipated. We ended up sitting on the edge of the bed, a natural closeness that had formed without discussion. The heat of the room no longer felt oppressive, it had become intimate, a shared cocoon where silence itself was comfortable. She laughed softly at something I said, leaning just slightly against my arm, and I felt the gentle pressure of her hand brushing against mine. It was fleeting, almost accidental, but it left a lingering warmth. My fingers twitched slightly, almost reaching for hers, but I paused, letting the moment breathe. There was a rhythm to these small gestures. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head when she looked at me, the gentle sighs as she relaxed into the blanket, all these moments were quietly powerful. Each one told me more about her than words could, her vulnerability, her trust, her subtle longing for connection. And in return, I found myself instinctively leaning closer, offering reassurance through proximity, through presence, through careful attentiveness. We spoke less now, letting the soft sounds of the room fill the spaces between us, the faint hum of the fan, the rustle of fabric as she shifted, the distant calls of the city waking outside. Every glance felt deliberate, every small touch weighted with meaning. I noticed the slight brush of her hand against my arm as she laughed, the way her shoulder grazed mine when she adjusted her sitting position. It wasn't romance in the conventional sense, but it was undeniably charged, filled with subtle longing and awareness. In that quiet morning, something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't a confession, not yet. It was a recognition of the intimacy that had formed, of the comfort in each other's presence. We were aware of each other in ways that went beyond friendship, beyond casual neighborliness. And as I watched her curls slightly beneath the blanket, the sunlight painting gentle highlights across her skin, I understood that these small, tender moments, the hand brushing, the shared laughter, the quiet companionship, were slowly, deliberately building a connection neither of us had expected but both of us were beginning to feel. The morning stretched, serene and unhurried, and for the first time, the room felt like more than a space shared out of circumstance. It had become a private world of subtle gestures and gentle warmth, where two people were learning, slowly and deliberately, how to be close without needing words. And in that space, I felt the first real stirrings of something that might grow, if only we allowed it, into something far more profound. By late morning, the oppressive night had given way to a softer heat, sunlight spilling lazily through the curtains. The room felt different now, no longer just a shared space, but a quiet stage for unspoken truths. We sat close, though not intentionally, and the air between us seemed heavier with all the things we hadn't said. The warmth of our earlier gestures lingered, but now it was accompanied by a tension that was emotional rather than physical. She broke the silence first, her voice gentle, almost tentative. "I sometimes wonder if I can even do this," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I mean, being interested in someone so much younger, society wouldn't exactly approve," and her words trailed off, leaving the thought suspended between us. I swallowed hard, feeling a sudden tightness in my chest. Her honesty was unexpected, but also grounding. I think about that too," I admitted quietly. "I don't know if I'm overstepping or imagining things. But I also know that when I'm with you, I feel understood." My words were cautious, deliberate, because even speaking them made my heart race. For a moment, we just looked at each other. There was a vulnerability in her eyes I had never seen before, an openness, a subtle plea for understanding. I realized that this wasn't just about fleeting attraction or accidental closeness. This was about something far more profound, the recognition that despite the age gap, despite hesitation, despite fear, there was an undeniable connection forming between us. She shifted slightly, brushing her hand against mine, not by accident this time, but slowly, deliberately. The contact sent a jolt through me, a mix of comfort and longing. It was intimate, but still entirely appropriate, and the simplicity of the gesture made it feel more powerful than any words could. Her fingers lingered for a moment, and I let my hand rest under hers, neither pulling away nor pressing forward. We spoke then, carefully, about fears and desires that we usually kept hidden. She shared moments of loneliness, doubts about whether she was still attractive or worthy of attention at her age, and a deep longing for someone who could see her as more than just her experience or her appearance. I shared my own hesitations, the fear of misreading signals, the worry that I might be crossing boundaries, the quiet amazement that someone so extraordinary could even notice me. The room felt charged, not with heat, but with honesty. Every glance, every subtle movement, every pause in the conversation carried weight. We were vulnerable, exposed in a way that felt frightening and exhilarating at the same time. I realized that the night had evolved into something far beyond a simple act of kindness. It had become a space where two people were daring to show the parts of themselves they usually hid, daring to acknowledge a connection that was slowly becoming undeniable. By the time the conversation faded into a reflective silence, I felt a quiet intensity lingering in the air. Her hand still rested near mine, a fragile bridge between hesitation and desire, and I understood that the emotional vulnerability we had shared tonight had changed everything. Nothing had been decided, yet everything felt different. The bond between us had deepened, and with it, the tension, the unspoken acknowledgement that our feelings were real, complicated, and growing stronger by the minute. The afternoon sun had softened to a warm, golden glow, spilling through the curtains and painting the room in honeyed light. The heat had finally faded to a gentle warmth, leaving behind the lingering traces of the night and morning, the quiet closeness, the subtle touches, the moments where neither of us could ignore the growing tension between us. She was sitting near the door, preparing to leave, her movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to delay the inevitable separation. I found myself watching her, noticing the way her fingers lingered over the blanket, the soft curve of her shoulders in the sunlight, the faint nervous flutter in her expression. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses you to speak or to act, to acknowledge the truth hanging between two people. My heartbeat seemed to echo in the silence. She paused at the doorway, glancing back at me with eyes that held unspoken questions. The hesitation in her gaze mirrored my own. For a moment, neither of us spoke, letting the weight of the night and morning settle around us. Then, without thinking too much, I stepped closer, reaching out gently to take her hand. Her fingers rested lightly against mine, warm and reassuring, and a shiver of electricity ran through me. I started, then stopped, unsure how to put into words the mix of admiration, attraction, and respect I felt. I don't want to pretend that this night hasn't mattered. That you haven't mattered. Her breath caught slightly, and I saw the faintest smile tug at the corners of her lips. It has, she admitted softly. I wasn't expecting any of this. But being here, with you, it feels right. Even if it's complicated. We stood there, hands still touching, letting the silence speak for the words we couldn't find. There was an honesty in her eyes, a gentle acknowledgement that she felt the same pull, the same quiet longing, the same tension we had both been aware of for hours. It wasn't bold or dramatic, it was subtle, tender, a shared recognition of a connection that had grown in the spaces between laughter, small touches, and whispered confidences. I like you, I said finally, the words simple but deliberate. Not just tonight, but in a way that makes me want to know you more, even if it's scary. She looked down at our hands, then back up at me, eyes glistening slightly. I like you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could, but I do. We lingered there, the room wrapped in warm sunlight, the quiet hum of the city outside. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just two people acknowledging a fragile, budding connection. Her hand squeezed mine briefly, a small, grounding gesture, and I felt the depth of what had formed between us. It wasn't just attraction, it was trust, understanding, and the beginning of something neither of us could ignore. When she finally stepped back to leave, our hands slowly parted, but the warmth lingered in the space where they had touched. The unspoken promise was there, a tentative beginning, delicate but undeniable, that would shape the days to come. And in that moment, I knew that nothing about this accidental night would ever feel ordinary again. By the time the afternoon had fully settled into early evening, the golden light had softened into a gentle amber glow. The room, which had felt so small and charged when she first arrived, now seemed vast in contrast to the closeness we had shared. She stood near the door, gathering her things, and I felt a quiet pang of reluctance, an unwillingness to let this fragile connection slip away. She looked at me, her gaze hesitant yet filled with a warmth that had grown over the course of the night. "Thank you," she said softly, almost a whisper. "For everything. For letting me stay, and for listening. For just being here." Her voice carried layers I couldn't fully name: gratitude, affection, relief, and something tenderly unspoken. I stepped closer, offering a small, reassuring smile. "It wasn't just about the night," I said quietly. "It was about you. And I'm glad you stayed." My fingers brushed lightly against hers as I spoke, a gesture that lingered longer than necessary. The contact wasn't dramatic or bold, but it conveyed more than words could, an acknowledgement of the bond we had formed, delicate yet undeniable. She returned the smile, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I wasn't expecting this night to feel like this," she admitted. Her eyes flicked down briefly, then back to mine, holding a mix of vulnerability and quiet courage. "But I'm glad it did." We lingered there for a moment longer, the hum of the city outside a distant echo compared to the intimate stillness between us. I wanted to say more, to bridge the distance with words, but the truth was that the unspoken was enough. The gentle touches, the shared laughter, the lingering glances, they all spoke volumes about what we had discovered in each other's presence. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, resting her forehead against mine for a brief, tender moment. Her hand brushed softly against my cheek, a gesture that was intimate but entirely appropriate, filled with warmth and trust. "Goodbye, for now," she whispered, and I could hear the softness of emotion beneath the simplicity of her words. I watched her step toward the door, then pause, glancing back one last time. Our eyes met, and in that look was everything we hadn't said aloud: the acknowledgement of feelings, the promise of connection, and the certainty that this night had changed us both. When she finally left, the room felt emptier, yet warmer somehow, filled with the echoes of shared laughter, soft touches, and quiet confidences. I sank onto the bed, taking a deep breath, replaying the moments of the night and morning in my mind. Every smile, every brush of hands, every glance lingered vividly, leaving me with a sense of profound connection and a quiet anticipation of what might come next. Though she had returned to her own space, the bond we had formed remained, alive and tender, like the fading warmth of the sun that had bathed the room. And in that stillness, I understood something important: this night had been accidental, unexpected, and ordinary on the surface, but beneath it, it had been extraordinary. It wasn't just a night of inconvenience or circumstance. It was the beginning of something real, something subtle yet undeniable, a connection that would stay with us, changing the way we saw each other, and the way we approached what might come next. As the night ended and the morning light faded, I realized some connections change us forever. If you felt the tension, the warmth, or the quiet magic of this night, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because there are more stories of unexpected moments and slow-burning connections waiting for you.